Good afternoon from Athens, and welcome to Museum as Heist, between the Benin bronzes and the Elgin Marbles. I'm pleased to bring into dialogue today two esteemed colleagues who, personally, I've had the chance to meet through the Decolonize Hellas initiative. Dan Hicks, who is coming to us from London today, curator, or perhaps from Oxford, curator at Oxford's Pitt-Rivers Museum and author of the award-winning book, The Brutish Museums, The Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution, which shines a spotlight on the ultra-violence and brutal history of the pillaging of Benin City by the British in 1897 and the installing of those stolen objects in private collections, ethnographic museums like the Pitt-Rivers Museum, and chiefly the British Museum. While the long-term activism around the restitution of the Benin bronzes is a core and critical piece of the contemporary agenda of decolonizing museums and the drive towards reparations for colonial extraction on a structural level, the even longer history of the Greek bid for the return of the so-called Elgin Marbles appears siloed from these struggles, while seen as nationalist within Greek contexts. Our other discussant, Lylaah Bhalerao, who's coming to us from New York today, has documented this shielding off of Hellas in her work, both scholarly and activist, on decolonizing museums, classics, and the university. Lylaah has recently defended her master's thesis at Cambridge on displaying Greece in the British Museum in the era of decolonization. She's currently researching in the field of critical ancient world studies at New York University. I'm very grateful to Esther Solomon, who is here with us today, for accepting my invitation to moderate this discussion on colonial histories of cultural looting, epistemic structures of white supremacy, prospects for the decolonizing, maybe the abolition of the British Museum, and the place of Hellas in all of this. Esther is an archaeologist, museologist, curator, and professor at the University of Ioannina. She's a faculty member in our Decolonized Hellas student network and editor of the recent volume, Contested Antiquity, Archaeological Heritage and Social Conflict in Modern Greece and Cyprus. Before we begin, I just want to encourage you to write your comments in the chat. I will be following them, and we hope to have 10, 15 minutes for conversation and questions at the end. Esther.
Καλησπέρα. Hello, everybody. Shall we connect with Lylaah and Dan?
I believe we're connected.
Hello there.
Okay, hello.
Hi.
Hello. We are really glad to have you here with us today. And as you have probably read on the website of Decolonize Hellas, museums are a very central theme of the whole initiative, and all these critical discussions, also aim to analyze the way museums have been involved in European colonialism, and also to make us think new ways of approaching all these issues, and to interrogate ways of museum decolonization. So we're really glad to have you with us today. And so we thought, instead of having a traditional panel structure, just to start, not with an introduction or brief presentations, but with the actual questions I have prepared for you, and then we will be glad to receive questions from all the other participants. So the first thing I would like to ask you is to explain how issues regarding museum decolonization have covered a great part of your work. So I would like to start with you, Dan, and explain a little bit the place of these issues in your work.
course, yes, it's really wonderful to be here. And also, I mean, not only speaking to this group, but also over at the moment, social media via the Spaces function on Twitter. So hello, everyone who's also hearing us there. So yeah, I think the decolonization question is one which has been addressed so far in the context of anthropology museums. So this is a really interesting conversation to be right at the start of, in terms of how this relates to sort of Europe, to the art and architecture and heritage of the classical sort of past, and where does Greece really fit? And so obviously the Elgin Marbles fit into the wider conversations over returns, but how can we see them as part of a conversation over what some are calling the decolonization of our museums, or indeed our universities, because this is about knowledge as well, but which I would prefer to see as the unfinished work of anti-colonialism and really anti-racism. So for me, the decolonial conversation, remembering that here in Europe, we don't have the same nuance that's there in a North American context, where the decolonial, is about land, is about actually conversations happening on stolen land. Here in Europe, we think more in terms of stolen art, stolen culture, and the efforts that were taken not only to undertake a cultural dispossession, but to use sort of culture for the enaction and the creation of cultural whiteness. So for me, I think this conversation, and it's wonderful to have Lylaah as a part of this conversation, because I think the dialogue in between us is not only helpful because we're talking from different sort of disciplinary perspectives, but also from different locations in North America and in Europe. And I think that in different ways, we're looking at these issues over cultural whiteness in, I think, really, complementary ways. So I think that that's enough from me, and let's hope this is going to be a sort of a back and forth and a two-way thing in between us, rather than long speeches from me. So I'll hand back over.
To answer the question. Hi, Lylaah.
Hi. Yes, I'm coming to you from North America, although, as you can probably tell by my accent, I'm not North American. Before I get started on my thoughts, I'd just like to say thank you to the Decolonize Hellas organizers for inviting me to speak today, especially as a young PhD student who's just starting to come up in the field. I appreciate being given the space to contribute to this conversation and to share the stage with much more established academics. I'm just starting to learn about the different ways that decolonization manifests in North America, as opposed to how we understand it in a more British or European context. And as Dan said, decolonization emerged amongst Indigenous scholarship in North America and also in Australia and New Zealand about the return of land. And I always like to remind people of the Tuck and Wayne Yang article called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And I think it's very important to be mindful of what they caution us against, which is turning it into a fix-all for our problems in society. And I think that decolonization has become a term associated with a societal movement in Britain and in the rest of Europe. And I think that's perfectly valid, but we do have to remember that it has its roots in a more land-based repatriation setting. But there's also the distinction between decolonization, which is about land, and decoloniality, which has become a school of thought in its own right, kind of like post-colonialism, and that emerged from Latin American scholarship. And I think that decoloniality is more what we're striving for, because decoloniality aims to untangle our society and our production of knowledge from Western European superiority and this idea that Western knowledge can be exported throughout the whole world. And I think that where mine and Dan's interests intersect is in that entanglement between these ideas of Western knowledge, and particularly how they get projected onto the material culture of other parts of the world in Africa or in the Eastern Mediterranean. So in my own work, I'm very interested in how we can use this idea of decoloniality to untangle heritage sites and sculptures in the Eastern Mediterranean from the ways that Western European imperialism had an impact in that region. And I think that I mostly focus on Greece and Turkey, but I think that what is going on in Greece and Turkey is also partly a projection of what people see going on in the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean with Syria and Iran and Iraq. And I think those dynamics have an impact on people, on how people view the importance of classical heritage in Greece and Turkey. In my activism, I'm also very committed to anti-racism and decolonization within museums and universities, which is a particularly controversial and hot topic in Britain at the moment. We seem to be going through a culture war, or a supposed culture war. And I do think that, I like to think that there's a difference. I like to think that there's a difference, and I think that decolonization is not just anti-colonialism. It can be a more constructive form of thought, where we also think about how we can construct new methodologies and new ways of doing things.
So, hi, good. So let's go a little bit further and tackle the issue of Hellas, and ask you, what would Hellas mean to you, and you relate all this to the whole decolonization issue, museum decolonization issue. Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So really just to build on and acknowledge everything Lylaah just said, which was absolutely spot on. You know, I think we can take this further and say, so what is it that is going on when we see the polishing of the Elgin marbles in order to make them as white as possible in, 1938? What is going on when we understand the museum in the 19th century in Europe as a museum of bodies? These are bodies in terms of human remains, the racist displays of sort of physical remains of people to tell the racist lie that there were different species or sort of types of human, but also encountering in the museum the bodies in terms of stone sculptures, and that sense that the museum became a space to which you bring your own body and encounter other bodies. If you read the early descriptions of the British Museum in, say, the 1840s, these are very corporeal spaces. They're full of humanity being enacted in different ways and different kinds of humanity. So I think to think about Hellas in this context, we can start maybe with the Sylvia Wynter observation, the key Jamaican thinker on the question of what she would call the liberal humanism that came about in the wake of Darwin, in the wake of emancipation and abolition. There's a crisis for whiteness at this point in the middle of the 19th century in Europe, whereby the work of abolition and emancipation is said to be over. Now, of course, we know today that work is not over, and maybe that's one way that we can frame this conversation. But the argument at the time, or the argument that Wynter would sort of put, would be that, okay, there's a fading away of the biological notions of human difference. But as we learn also from Frantz Fanon in his essay on racism and culture, what Fanon described as the vulgar racism that emerged at first, that came very soon, he said, in the 1950s. It came very soon in the 19th century to be accompanied by what he identifies as a cultural racism, the use of art and culture to enact human difference. Now, we know in anthropology museums that, of course, is the racist lie of the primitive, of the notion of the barbaric. It turns into, over the long course of the 19th century, a set of stories about improvement and cultural stages. And of course, that means it's also about the notion of the civilized, of civilization. So it turns out, I think what we're learning at this point in conversations around the decolonization of knowledge and the decolonization of our museums, which are central spaces for that work to happen, we're learning that art and culture was central to a form of racism that is with us in the present. And it isn't just, this conversation we're having now isn't some sideshow to the so-called real work of anti-racism. These institutions were central to the creation of a set of myths, which were the cultural supremacist myths of essentially, late 19th century empire, with which we are still living. They're starting to fail. And we're seeing them, and they're actually, in some ways, they are resurgent at this moment because they are losing their grip. So the culture war that Lylaah rightly mentions is, in fact, a war on culture, a war with culture, the weaponization of culture that starts with the display of the Parthenon marbles, or indeed, as we might say, the Elgin marbles, because I think we need to continue to call the Elgin marbles until their return to the Parthenon. Let's center Elgin in this conversation, not to center a dead white man in the conventional way, but to center him in the way that we center Edward Colston when we pull him down, or we center Rhodes in the Rose Must Fall campaign. So I think looking at these figures, looking at Elgin as one example, as he is confused with the marbles themselves, as antiquity itself is used to form a sort of timelessness and notion of civilization, which is so hard to get past, hard to refuse. In doing that, let's see that actually the image of Elgin is like what Winter describes as, that model of man, which it turns out isn't a universal human. It's a male, it's a cis male, white, sort of European, of course. So that's what we're trying to dismantle here, I think, in some ways. And there's a whole nexus of intersections in between masculinity and whiteness and art and culture.
Thank you, John. And Lylaah, we're really looking forward to hearing you.
I think I'm going to stick a bit more closely to the idea of Hellas and the word Hellas and understanding what it means. And this is probably me doing what classicists do. I decided to look into the etymology of the word Hellas. And I discovered that Hellas is first used to refer to Greece as all the lands inhabited by the Hellenes, the Greeks, by Herodotus, and almost exclusively used in that context by Herodotus. But by ancient authors, it's more often used to refer to a part of Greece, normally northern Greece. And in modern Greek, Hellas doesn't mean Greece. The word for Greece is entirely different. So then what is Hellas if it isn't Greece, the country? I think that Hellas is a concept. It represents the ideal of Greece. And that ideal was one that was shaped by the Western European powers when Greece was still under Ottoman rule. And that is the ideal that drove them to go to Greece and help Greece get independence, because they idealized classical Athens and saw it as this ideal civilization that embodied the values that they came to see as European values and modern values. So in that way, Hellas is a concept that emerged in Western imagination, but it therefore also became the expectations of a modern Greece. It represents an ideal civilization. It represents the ideal civilization that Western European powers wanted to see put into place in Greece when Greece gained their independence from the Ottomans. So it's a concept that was not necessarily created by Greeks. It was created by Western European powers, but it was a concept that was then applied onto the new nation of Greece. And I think it's a concept that has also become embroiled in Greek nationalism, both in the 19th century and also today, because I think that modern Greece is still trying to achieve this ideal of Hellas. And in my work, I spend a lot of time trying to understand that and trying to untangle the Elgin Marbles from getting caught up in that ideal representation of Greece.
Thank you. Going a little bit further and let's say inside the British Museum and start talking about the display itself of the Elgin Marbles. So I would like to ask you to comment on the relationship of the display with all these issues about white supremacy.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. So yeah, I mean, let's say at the outset, I mean, you've asked me to come into this conversation because of my work on African cultural restitution. So let's say at the outset that there's a lot of sort of whataboutism and where will it endism that we encounter in the sort of conversations around the return of African objects. We're at a watershed moment. I mean, last week with the formal announcement and the ceremony in Paris for the Benin objects being returned by the French government, my colleague Bénédicte Savoy at that meeting compared that return to the falling of the Berlin Wall. And I think that is not hyperbole. This is the significance of this moment that we find ourselves in now, with the willingness on a case-by-case basis, but at scale and at pace, to see the return of African objects when they are demanded, to start to understand what's in the collections, not only on display, but in the stores. That is a shift which is happening in France, here in the UK. In the same week, we saw the ceremonies undertaken in Cambridge and Aberdeen, because most of the African stolen objects in our museums in the UK are not in the British Museum. They're not in the national collections. They're in the regional collections. They're in Aberdeen and Cambridge, but they're also in Exeter, in Bristol, Birmingham, Belfast, Ipswich, I mean, you name it. Most of the cities of our country, because empire and the cultural dispossession that went hand in hand with the extreme violence of the later 19th century on the continent of Africa, that was embedded. It was deeply part of actually the civic institution of the museum in the regions, not only in the metropole. So exactly the same as in the Greek context, we have to be very careful to take apart restitution from nationalism. It's the same in the UK. We have to make, this is not, I mean, my book was about seeking to decenter the British Museum. The British Museum, as we learn again from my colleague Bénédicte Savoy's, important a book that she just published, which is called Afrika's Kampf seine Kunst, Africa's Struggle for Her Art. She makes in that book the key observation that in the Year of Africa in 1960, where I think 18 or 19 African nations in that 1 year gained independence, that was the beginning of a set of legal restrictions, a set of myths that were created by the UK sort of civil servants and the politicians and the museum directors, hand in hand with the Germans and the French, hand in hand with others, and a series of legal restraints here in the UK. That would be the Act of Parliament in 1963 in terms of the British Museum, but of course other nations were doing the same thing at the same moment. This work against restitution is incredibly recent, it's a post-colonial, it's a part of the decolonization of the 60s and 70s, where actually the pushback comes. Because of course, these independent nations understand that these items are about sovereignty, they're about identity, they're about culture. And of course, they continue to wish to see them returned. So what does that mean in terms of the Greek context? Well, as I say, let's be very careful not to say that all restitutions are the same as each other. This is not a campaign to empty out the British Museum or even to shut it down, in my view. But it is about the fact that our so-called, our self-proclaimed universal museums have to remove the myth of sort of universality. And our so-called world culture museums simply have to start again, so that there is, we need these institutions. We need to be able to look at art and culture outside of a Eurocentric lens. But that doesn't mean they should be filled with items that were stolen, where the demand for their returns are being made. This is about the museum as a space that can be more than simply what for maybe 30 years of its history it was co-opted into being, which is a tool or a mechanism or a weapon for white cultural supremacy. Our museums are far more than that. We need to make them fit for our times. So I think in terms of the issue of the Elgin Marbles and the return of them, this again has to be a matter that is taken on its own terms. But we have to be optimistic that a return is not a loss. This weird white fragility that we hear from our museums, that somehow this would be something that would leave a gap. Actually, this is, of course, all institutions have to allow themselves to change, and it would be that sort of that thing that's added with each return is a thing that's added to the civic value, to the international role, of arts and culture. So the white cultural supremacists of 100 years ago absolutely understood how important art and culture is. So do we in the present. We simply need to make our institutions fit for our times. And so returns have to be part of that. We're seeing that work now happen for Africa. We're seeing it happen across the continent of Africa, not only conversations about sub-Saharan Africa, but Egypt, of course, as well, and other parts of North Africa, that many museums have pretended aren't part of the continent of Africa or aren't actually a part of these conversations. So I think there's so much to be learned from comparing these different cases, but let's not go down the where will it endism, slippery slopeism argument that if you return one object, you're going to return everything. That certainly is not the case. But that doesn't mean that we should be setting arbitrary limits or returns or saying never to any individual return.
Okay, thank you very much. And Lylaah, about the British Museum display?
Yes, I think Dan spoke about his role as someone who works with African heritage in this conversation. So I think my role as the classicist is probably to give more specific answers to the Elgin Marbles themselves. I think what we're seeing in the relationship between the display in the British Museum and the display in the Acropolis Museum is a contest of space. These two bodies are bodies in terms of organizations, not bodies of human bodies. These two bodies are fighting it out over who has the most control over how these should be displayed and who has the better display. And I think in public consciousness at the moment, the Acropolis Museum is winning. The Devine Gallery has definitely gone out of fashion. If you walk through the British Museum, you kind of follow what many people call the chain of art, which is you start with Egyptian art with the Rosetta Stone and you walk in a straight line and you end up at the opening to the Devine Gallery. And from there, you walk into this neoclassical space with columns and grey walls that are supposed to mirror the marbles. The marbles almost become secondary decoration to the space of the gallery itself, which speaks to debates at the time about whether they were masterpieces or whether they were architectural decoration. And I think that particularly in classicist circles, people have become very disenchanted with the design of the Devine Gallery, which has helped the case of the Acropolis Museum, because the Acropolis Museum presents a strong visual claim to those marbles, not least because the museum is right next to the Acropolis, so it is physically closer to the original site. You kind of walk around it in the same plan as the Acropolis. You can look out the window at the sunny Parthenon. And of course, they have left gaps across the whole museum of where they want the returned pieces to go. My issue with the Devine Gallery is that the display of the marbles is so far removed from how they were originally displayed on the Acropolis. It changes the relationship that we as people have with the material culture around us. The Parthenon marbles were decorative sculpture and they were in a cult center in a religious setting. But by putting them in the British Museum and by putting them in a neoclassical gallery like the Devine Gallery, they've become aestheticized and they've become art objects, which they might not have been intended to be primarily. But even though the Acropolis Museum is physically closer to the original location of the marbles, does the display do anything different really to what the Devine Gallery does? I'm not convinced that it does. I mean, when I first visited the Acropolis Museum when I was 17 years old and I was a budding classicist, I found it incredibly powerful. And at that point in time, I was convinced that the marbles should be returned. But having done more critical analysis of both museums over the last year, I've realized that the same problems that are manifested in the Devine Gallery are also manifested in the Acropolis Museum. There is such a focus on the whiteness of the sculptures, of which Dan was just talking, even more so in the Acropolis Museum because they've used casts where they want the originals to go, and casts even highlight how white those sculptures are. And the light is so bright that they look incredibly white. It also sticks to this narrative of the Parthenon marbles being the best art ever produced, which they've done to kind of contribute to their narrative that they should have the marbles back, but it presents the same problems as the display that the British Museum follows. So when I think about whether the marbles should be returned, my position has become much more nuanced and maybe even contradictory in some ways, but I'm okay with that because there is no easy fix to this solution. There is no easy answer to decolonization. I think the first thing to notice is that whilst we don't want to go down the slippery slope of giving everything away and ending up with empty museums, as critics of restitution fear that we will, the return of the Elgin marbles can never be a partial restitution. They either, in my opinion, they either all have to leave the British Museum or none of them do. And that's because a lot of the arguments made, particularly by Geoffrey Robertson in his role as the lawyer on the side of the Acropolis Museum, is that they are part of the architectural integrity of the site, and that removing them compromised that integrity. And so that argument follows that they all have to go back if you want to kind of symbolically restore the integrity of that site. And the Acropolis Museum certainly would probably want them all back and to kind of have a unified display. But the other issue is that returning the Parthenon marble is not going to decolonize Hellas. It's not going to solve the issues that we have with racism and colonialism in Greece. In fact, it might even contribute to that heightened nationalism surrounding the ideal of Greece, of which I was speaking before. So I think that I'm coming around to the idea that perhaps they shouldn't be returned. And maybe the best thing is to keep them where they are, but really center a critical discourse around why they're there, how they got there, and how we can contribute to the conversation going forward.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think it opens up a very exciting discussion about museum decolonization without involving necessarily the return of the exhibits. But let's go and discuss a little bit further these issues of return, and to see if there are more things to say, ethical issues regarding the return of the Elgin marbles and the way these ideas of returning the marbles are related or distinguished from the decolonization issues you have already presented.
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, I wonder whether I could frame that as a question for Lylaah, actually, in some ways, which is how we are able to join the dots between this conversation we're having about art in museums and the wider questions over the decolonization of the disciplinary knowledge of ancient history, the notion of the classical past. And I ask that in the context, of course, of the comments that I'm sure everyone has seen of the Prime Minister of the UK in relation to the fall of Rome and the role of sort of borders and immigrants, you know, in that process. We're seeing a set of white nationalist sort of myths, which are not kind of from the past to be, you know, debunked. They're very much in the present. And the discipline of ancient history, the notion of the classical past is absolutely red-handed, right? It's at the heart of this. So we have a classicist, you know, as the Prime Minister, you know, which of course here in the UK reminds us of other classicists, most notably Enoch Powell, of course, and their role in extreme right sort of narratives of nativism, of exceptionalism, and the overlap into, you know, all these racist myths. So what's our role intellectually? What's our role, you know, when you're undertaking your research as a doctoral student at NYU? How can we join the dots between the conversation we're having over displays in museums and the urgent conversation to decolonize the absolute plain as day sort of uses and misuses of these narratives to, you know, to further racism in the present?
Firstly, on the Boris Johnson clip, I'm taking a course on societal collapse in the ancient world, and I played that clip in my class on Monday just to see what the reactions of all my classmates would be. And they were all, I mean, we all laughed, but it's also horrifying that he can, one, appropriate Roman history like that for such racist and right-wing supremacist means, but also that he can do so with incorrect historical information. You really have to be someone very special to get away with doing that, I think. So this question that you posed about how museums relate to the academic disciplines, I posed the exact same question in my master's thesis at Cambridge. I said, how much can museums actually change if the academic disciplines that surround them don't change at the same time? And I think there are two approaches to this. Either you could say the disciplines have to change first for the museums to change, because in most cases, the people that work in museums have studied in an academic discipline and they use the skills and knowledge that they have gained from that academic study in their jobs. And I think that a real limitation of museums, or these so-called encyclopedic museums today, is that they maintain the same academic boundaries of British academia. So kind of in British academia, we have this either geographical or chronological separation. And you see that maintained in museums, which I think is a barrier to us having thematic displays or cross-cultural displays, because no one really has the skills to do that if they've been trained in the academic systems that currently exist. But I think the other answer that I am leaning more towards now is that academic disciplines should take a back seat for a bit. Maybe museums need to diversify the pool of knowledge that we have, because if we're talking about decoloniality, we don't want to maintain the same systems of knowledge that have been held up in universities and then transferred into museums for the last 3 centuries. I think museums could do a really good job of saying, actually, to be a curator, you don't just have to have a PhD in a certain field study. You know, there are other skills that could be useful for that, either community action skills or being involved in local communities in a different country or engaging with local communities in Britain. And also maybe, you know, having worked in the policy sector or having worked in other areas of art. I think that really to begin to decolonize knowledge, you have to also make it less elite. And the current system of having to kind of get a PhD and then go work as a curator maintains those elite systems of knowledge that we are trying to challenge.
Can I jump in with a question? And also, We have a small audience here in Athens who might want to ask a question. You can prepare those if you have a question. I have one question for Dan. And something I found really interesting in your book was the emphasis on looting, on the violence of looting. And you made a critique of how in anthropology we have so many theories of the gift. It's almost like we're covering up this extensive histories and practices of theft. And I'm wondering, I mean, something that we're interested in this other workshop we're doing on monuments, like how do these objects, can they be deployed to reveal this violence of sort of desacralization and looting and a kind of, in your work, you really do make it seem like they're like like a gang of, sort of ruffians doing this instead of the idea of sort of this pristine, whatever, classicists doing, like the emphasis on custodianism, like going from that to who's a good custodian to the looting. So that's one thing I would be interested to hear about. And I would like to push Lylaah more, also based on reading your thesis. I think will be really interesting for a Greek audience, because one of the reasons I wanted to do this, this discussion is that in the Greek context, I mean, really, because of a sort of, I would say, strong anti-blackness, like the Benin bronze discussion, is never isn't really present even in sort of public debate. And I'm just wondering, like, how the way that the Hellas was in the museum was where there's all this activity on decolonizing the museum in other departments and other parts of the museum and exhibits that are sort of trying to move in that direction. It's almost like this sleepy corner, it sounds like, I don't know, where they were continually producing like the recent exhibit at the Louvre in Paris, a totally Orientalist, totally, I mean, I don't know, I'd like your opinion. I feel like this would never be able to be done to another, like an African country that could present such a really racist kind of discourse, but it's just sort of like a sleepy corner. So it's like, how can we bring, like the critique into that wing? That would be like also seeing how they're sort of just protected and not questioned. Within this paradigm of decolonizing.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so if maybe I'll go first with two really, really interesting questions. So the question for me was about violence and looting. So I think for a Greek audience, what I'd say is let's question the relationship of Greece to the colonial powers of Europe. Let's have that conversation about, not the gift, but the taking, and talk about it in terms of, say, debt, for example, indebtedness, inequality in the distribution of resource in terms of money, because it turns out that looting is not something, insofar as it emerged within this very particular set of actions that sought to create white cultural supremacy in between, let's say, the 1880s and the 1920s, this sort of proto-fascist phase of the use of culture, the culture concept for this sort of purpose. Let's remember, it didn't happen in the colonies. Looting did not happen in the crown colonies. It happened on the edges of empire. It happened in the protectorates. It happened in contexts that historians have variously called, informal empire. They've called it indirect rule. Sometimes they've even called it, gentlemanly capitalism. What's going on in the Greek case? What in the early 19th century is the British imperial interest in the antiquities of Greece? We need, I think the conversation among our Greek sort of colleagues here has to be, well, what relationship do we think maybe is ongoing in the present in terms of the wider economic situation of Greece, that is not sort of colonization in the way that we imagine it to be in terms of settler colonialism, but are there forms of extractivist colonialism, which is what we see in West Africa that's going on with the rubber plantations and the oil, the palm oil, and the interests which were really what, you know, the taking of the bronzes, the claiming of sovereignty, the removal of these items of identity and sovereignty and antiquity into the metropole. That's something that was also done to Greece, right? So we need to be very clear about what this very specific history of looting, and as you've said, you know, I do describe it as a particular method of violence, a particular military tactic within a very tight historical framing. You know, the Elgin Marbles is a bit of an outlier because it's early, but they are, you know, they're still there in the 1880s. They're still there in the 1930s when they're being used even more directly for the purposes of white supremacy. So at the heart of this then really is that sense that we, you know, here in Oxford in 1884, the year of the Berlin Congress, where Africa was carved up in between the European nations. Here in Oxford in 1884, in that same year, the Pitt-Rivers Museum, where I'm sitting now, the Museum of Anthropology for Oxford, was built. But so was another museum of archaeology and art, which is called the Ashmolean Museum, which, of course, if you go onto their website, they say they're a 17th century foundation. And it's absolutely right that some of the collections were in Oxford at that time, but on its, in terms of the location, the building it's in now, that's also opened in 1884. So the modern Ashmolean and here at the Pitt-Rivers, they're both creations of the same moment of time. The physical action of the West and the rest in two museums, you know, of art and archaeology. So this in the book is what I call the notion of the chronopolitical, the use of time in order to pretend that one set of individuals, of human beings, is in the past, you know, one is in the present. These are methods through which we also see, of course, in the creation of the border. So the motto of the British Museums, actually, when I was writing it, was something that came directly out of the work I had done on displaced people and the so-called refugee crisis that we did with the work around the Calais jungle. And so that motto was, as the border is to the nation state, so the museum is to empire. So the museum and the border are both 19th century technologies for making distinctions in between human beings. And so using culture in order to do that. So that's what we're, I think, sort of dealing with here. And so for a Greek audience, you know, let's see this conversation about returns not as simply kind of nationalism versus, you know, realpolitik. Let's see it as a reckoning with a particular set of histories in which our disciplinary structures and our museums, our sense of the past itself, is implicated in forms of violence that are maybe still going on. The debts are still outstanding. And for Greece, that maybe takes a different form. Maybe it's a wider question of resource. But actually, if you look at the Nigerian debate, if you look at the Ghanaian arguments, if you look at the reparations debates in the Caribbean, there's no sense in which this isn't also about resource, about money. So let's think about the Greek role in the wider European project. Let's look at the role that it plays as a border in Fortress Europe at a time at which so many people every year are dying in the Mediterranean. These distinctions between different types of human have never been more important to break down and to resist. And art and culture has been part of how we built the notion of Europe, the notion of civilization, and that is a part of what we need to be dismantling now.
I'd like to quickly add something about looting. I think of the 19th century as a century of looting, particularly British imperial looting. It all begins in Egypt in 1801 with the defeat of Napoleon, after which Britain claimed his looted antiquities, including the Rosetta Stone. And at this point in history, when they could have given them back to the Egyptians, they instead decided to send them to the British Museum, where they have been ever since. And that was the first public collection to enter the museum. And it inaugurates this century of looting. And the case of Egypt is directly linked to Greece because Elgin was the ambassador of Greece at the time. And just a few weeks after Napoleon was defeated in Egypt, which was also Ottoman territory, he received his so-called and supposed firman to excavate at the Acropolis. So it was in his role as ambassador from Britain, the country that had just helped defend Ottoman territory, that he was able to take advantage and loot the Acropolis. And I think that whilst the Acropolis is an early case, it's important to remember that this does begin in Egypt, and it begins as a war between two imperial powers that then becomes a war of antiquities that defines the 19th century and also much of the 20th century as well. And, you know, it begins in Egypt and it goes all the way up to Benin and Dan's focus. And it continues, I also would argue, in kind of the post-First World War, when all these nations come together to try and form an international body to legislate and oversee the heritage of the world. And I've just finished writing a chapter on the role of UNESCO and its agenda in the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly thinking about the controversy over Hagia Sophia and why it matters so much to them that it's gone back to being a mosque. And I think I'm going to use this to segue into answering Penelope's question about anti-Blackness, because I find it very interesting and I need to learn more about how anti-Blackness manifests in Greece, because I don't know as much as I think that I should yet. And I also think that I'm wary and I'm very aware of my position in this discussion because I'm not Greek. I haven't grown up in Greece or lived in Greece, so I can't speak to the intricacies of how racism might develop in Greece, but I'm also not white. So I'm not projecting white privilege or European history and identity onto my understanding of Greece. And I'd be interested to hear, Dan, what you think about this and how you orient your own position in this discussion. So I think that I do have an understanding of the impact of racist narratives on heritage, but mine is very much a British perspective. And Greece occupies this interesting position, in my understanding, where they are both orientalized by the powers to the west and orientalizing the countries to the east of them. And I think that we see this in recent history, actually, when I was researching for this chapter that I've just written, where refugees who have ended up living in relocation camps in Greece have been taken on trips to visit the Acropolis. And these are refugee children, a lot of them girls who wear hijabs, and you can see in the photos all these pictures of hijabi women walking around the Acropolis. And to me, it sends a very unsettling narrative of what are we trying to say, that the Acropolis represents Europe and that now these refugees must kind of adopt these European values and a European way of life. And it creates this kind of dichotomy between the countries that they've come from that have been, you know, they've been ruined by war that has been caused by European neocolonialism, and they've been forced to flee their countries and come and live in Europe. And their countries have also, you know, they're from places where we've seen classical heritage being destroyed by extremists, and now we're sending them to the Acropolis. Are we trying to say, you don't understand classical heritage, you need to understand it? But that also ignores the fact that they come from a culture that has rich classical heritage and that members of their own community have died trying to protect it. So I see a very orientalizing narrative taking place in that practice of taking refugees to the Acropolis. And in the news items, you hear about the Greek foreign minister and other people who attend the event talking about how, you know, the Acropolis represents our European values about democracy and freedom and liberty. And we're kind of caught in this conundrum of seeing European values as that and seeing anything else, particularly Islamic society, as very other. And I feel that in the conversation over heritage, this is just becoming even more the case, and people are, you know, it's becoming even more polarized because of what a few extremists are doing in a certain part of the world. And they don't represent the religion at large, but the impact that they have on heritage it's kind of controlling the conversation, I think. And to link this back to anti-Blackness, Islamophobia and anti-Blackness, I think, are becoming more and more of an issue in the Eastern Mediterranean because of the refugee crisis and these large forms of migration. And I think that in thinking about the Acropolis and thinking about how it serves the local community, we have to begin to realize that the Black community and the Muslim community is a new constituent in Greece, who also have to form their own relationship with heritage and whose interpretations we would like to value, rather than kind of dictating to them that they must appreciate the classical beauty of the Parthenon.
I have a comment here to read, which from Safo Papandonopoulou. She says, it's important to note that the process of stealing, in quotes, the marbles from us, in quotes, the very us who was stolen from us was constructed. The Greek response to colonialism was nationalism, which reproduced the very discourses and practices of colonialism in order to respond to it. One of your fans, Lylaah, has said that this is exactly what you were saying, but I think it's also a good point to just, emphasize that if returning the marbles isn't about critiquing Western white supremacy, then indeed I agree with your point. If it's just a support of nationalism, because it doesn't actually, this is where I would say the anti-Blackness, that this isn't seen as anything that has to do with whiteness. So if they came back to Greece now, this would not be the discussion. And in fact, it could reinforce what you've just been describing with the example of the refugee visits, that this could be a sort of a stronghold to reproduce this Western civilizational narrative, precisely because there's absolutely no pressure or critique on it in our context. I mean, it's sort of a bold statement, but a very small one. Like, this is what our conference is about. So, that was.
If I could just add on that, is that okay? But yeah, just on that point. I mean, I think it's exactly right. But of course, let's remember that precisely what you're describing is already happening right now in London, right? These are displays that are put to work for precisely the cultural supremacy, the white cultural supremacy that you're describing. It's happening with these items in London. So if we're talking about returns, absolutely, let's put at the heart of this, this isn't a false choice. This is not the false choice between either nationalism or the status quo. It is possible, as in the Nigerian case, for returns not to be about the role of the nation state as the inheritor of essentially imperial sort of violence, right? I mean, precisely the same issues over the nation state, are at stake in other contexts, in indigenous contexts, in African contexts. So we need to I don't think it's enough anymore to keep ourselves in the arguments that were there 30 years ago that say returning the Parthenon marbles is a bad idea because it's going to support a certain form of nationalism. Let's reimagine, absolutely, as I'm sure colleagues are doing, what that return could be like, because from our side in the UK, the dismantling of that story of white cultural supremacy is central to what we want from our museums.
So thank you so much. And having arrived at this point, I would like to bring into the discussion the notion of activism, and also this role of a museum curator as activist. As activists, something, a capacity, a capacity among many others. So I would like to ask about your own attitudes and your own ideas concerning this aspect of the curator's work.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I'll go first on that one, maybe just to say, in some ways, there's no book in my field, or in any field, I think, that's sort of dated faster than the book that that has the title The History of the World in 100 Objects. And so Neil MacGregor, who at the time ran the British Museum, wrote this book 10 years ago, where he tells the history of the whole world. Again, it's a male, white, UK-based voice who uses the ability to pull objects in from around the world, all from the collections of the British Museum, and to tell a story of the world that he probably could have told without the objects, because it's a fairly familiar story. It isn't just that kind of history, that universalist history has dated. The notion of how you work as a curator was already at that time out of date. We're no longer that figure that, you know, that he represented, that I, in my role as a cis male, white curator at an elite institution, that I certainly sort of could also play. That role is dead. That role, we're not curators, we're co-curators. We are led, have to be led by our audiences, by our stakeholders, by the partnerships that we undertake in really reimagined, inequitable terms. We have to be giving up sort of power. We have to be undermining ourselves. So I think, for me, I don't identify as an activist because I'm just doing my job. I'm a curator. I think I would not trust a curator activist because the risk is always the co-option of these narratives. I listen to the activists when they are campaigning, you know, outside the Pitt-Rivers, as they were in 2015 to 16 with the Rose Must Fall movement. And in general, of course, I listen to activists of all kinds when they are talking about museums, but I'm not an activist myself. What I have to do, though, is not just state my positionality and my privilege, because often that just reflexively re-emerges, the same figure re-emerges, just a little bit more sensitive and a little bit more self-aware, but actually it's the same old guy, sort of yet again, here I am. My role in this is to undermine myself in whatever meaningful way that can take up. So part of the role of the curator today has to be the dismantling of the white infrastructure of the museum, of the patriarchy of the museum. And that involves everybody. Of course, we have to diversify ourselves urgently, but we can't wait until we are diverse in a generation's time until we're actively doing this work. So the work of a curator these days is not not to be an activist, but it certainly is to be an anti-racist.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer. It's really precious also for the world of museum professionals. And Lylaah, your ideas will be also very much appreciated, also from the side of a PhD student in this field.
The British Museum, as of 2020 and early 2021, had no Black curators, according to a report that was found by people, I think, rather than actively put out there. So they were exposed as having no Black curators. And as long as that is the case, and as long as there are no Black curators and very few other people of colour working at the British Museum, things will not change. It has been proven by critical race theorists, particularly Sarah Ahmed, that people of colour are the ones that bring race and decolonization into the discussion. So if in your curatorial meetings and your leadership meetings and your board meetings there aren't people of colour there, then who is going to initiate change and who is going to implement it? Who has the understanding of the local community and historic experiences of generational racism to bring to the discussion? So I think the first thing that has to change is that curatorial staff have to be much more diverse than they currently are. And if we go back to Penelope's point about anti-Blackness in Greece, I don't know exactly what the racial demographics of Greece are, but I don't know how you would get narratives that are anti-racist if you don't have curators that are not ethnically European, let's say. So you need the people in the jobs getting paid the salaries to make the changes. And that's where, if we say that decolonization is not a metaphor, this is the material part of it. if we reappropriate decolonization in our non-Indigenous context, where it's not about land restitution, it can be about other forms of material reparations like jobs, salaries, scholarships, etc. My personal career goal is to become a curator, but I'm not sure that once I am, that I would be able to separate my activist identity from my curator identity so easily. I don't think that's a luxury that I have as a person of color, and particularly a woman of color who lives at that intersection. Because for me, activism is not something, it's something that I wish I didn't have to do. I wish we lived in a world where it wasn't necessary, but unfortunately we don't. And so I don't engage in activism because I find it fun or interesting. I engage in activism because I see it as necessary for my community to survive, or ideally to thrive. But at points in the last few years, we've been talking about pure survival here in terms of just getting through COVID and other crises that have come along as a community. And so I think that in whatever job that I may have in a museum in the future, I won't be able to remove that from it. And I think the idea of, just like the idea of a universal museum is a myth, the idea of a curator who can be neutral is a myth. And that's not to say that I won't be able to separate my identity and my activism from the material when it needs to be. It doesn't mean that I will see race in every Roman sculpture, but I think it means that I will ask the right questions when they need to be asked, or think about what narratives, what alternative narratives could we present here, or what other communities could we reach out to with the exhibition that we're working with. And I think that that's where a curator who has an activist identity could be useful. It's not that, you know, you're actively trying to promote an activist agenda through your work. It's that you are at least engaged in the ideas and the community activism, and you can bring that in when it's necessary. But for all of that to change, first and foremost, the museum staff has to change. And we've been talking about curators, but I'd also like to hear what Dan and maybe also our colleagues in Greece think about boards, because I think boards are crucial in this conversation. To go back to the British Museum, in the 19th century, men moved between cabinet positions and roles on the board of the British Museum so easily. And I kind of look at the person who was recently appointed chairman of the British Museum, and I think, what has changed there? Is that not the exact same dynamic that has persisted 300 years, 200, 300 years, that people are moving between high-level cabinet positions and leadership positions of our museums? And how could our government and top academics ever claim that museums are neutral and are not political spaces when that has always been the case? So I think that that is something very interesting to bear in mind, but also donors and boards, because the British Museum has a big issue with BP as a sponsor at the moment. And I also think that just as decolonization exists alongside anti-capitalism and forms of Marxist and socialist theory, a decolonial museum cannot be a museum that is invested in enterprises like oil and that is reliant on the support of big corporations either. And Dan, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Okay, absolutely, yeah. So in the final minute or two, because I think we need to finish at 5:02 or shortly after. Yeah, I mean, just to say, I agree with absolutely all of that. The question on boards are spaces, rare spaces in these worlds that you can actually diversify incredibly fast, because the process of appointment is very, very different to having to train up a whole sort of pipeline to diversify workforce. That you're able to bring in as trustees a whole host of other expertise and diversify yourself. So yeah, absolutely. That's why the argument over who's appointed to the boards of museums is part of this war on culture that the government in the UK are fighting. So yeah, I mean, I can't add anything more to everything you said. Was just exactly right. I totally agree.
So,
yeah, and in terms of, I mean, I think I will have to go away and think about the really important points you made about how do you, in refusing the activist identity, which of course is often a slur, are you feeding into narratives that the museum is actually, able to be neutral, which of course I wouldn't agree with. So that's incredibly challenging. Thank you so much for that.
As it's about time to conclude, there are so many things that we could discuss further. I just want to focus on one of the ideas you put forward related to the possibilities given by the museum space itself, the museum institution itself as a political space where the display of objects can make us think and can make us being critical over all these issues. So some of these debates may begin from the museum space itself when this space is open enough to include this kind of narratives, either deriving from academics, from students, from other collectivities, and from people who want to change things. And if I may, I would like just to finish with the fact that the British Museum itself has also allowed some of these discussions, and being part of an extremely interesting program from museum professionals, mainly from Africa and Asia and Latin America, just gave us the opportunity to tackle these issues and see how the role of the curator can change and include different views. Even the views of the late Ian Jenkins from the Greek and Rome department, and whose ideas were included in several exhibition projects, some of which started in the context of the British Museum itself. Just keep, these notions and see how we can be more inclusive and also more activist in all senses of the world that you put forward in your presentation. So thank you so much, Lylaah, and thank you so much, Dan, and also the people who commented and asked questions. And I hope that we can continue this kind of discussions further and further. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you.